Welcome to our listeners. I'm very pleased today to introduce Graham St. John. And the topic of our conversation is the experiment at La Chorrera. It's my great pleasure to have this conversation with Graham St. John. He is a cultural anthropologist. He specializes in transformational events and movements, and he's written 8 books, but the one most relevant to this conversation is The Mystery School in Hyperspace, A Cultural History of DMT, which if you have not read it, you should order it immediately. It's a very interesting book about a very interesting molecule known to many of you in the McKenna circles. And he's also written other books, one called Global Tribe, Technology, Spirituality, and Psytrance in 2012. And he's the executive editor of Dance Cult, the Journal of Electronic Dance Music Culture. And he's currently working on a biography of Terence, my brother, and I've been answering questions for that as well as I could, and I'm really looking forward to this. Graham is an excellent scholar. He goes very deep. So that's going to be a great book. His website for more information is edgecentral.net. So you can see what he's up to there. And thank you, Graham, for coming on and being our guest for this conversation.
Well, thanks for having me, Dennis. Thanks for that wonderful introduction. And yes, the expedition, the freak expedition to La Chorrera is, I guess, it's a hallmark, freak journey into the Amazon that is intriguing as well as as much as it is perplexing, and so it's a great opportunity for us to chat about that 50 years down the track, and maybe excavate some new meaning behind it all. So this was an expedition that involved a handful of people, including you and your brother, to the Amazon in 1971, March 1971. So where did this idea for this expedition arise, and what was the original motivation and purpose for it?
The cursory answer and the long answer. The cursory answer is that yes, it was me and Terence and 3 of our equally fanatical friends who were basically immersed in the psychedelic subculture. My brother in particular was in the experimental college at Berkeley, and all of our companions were people that he knew in that program. I guess the question is, what possessed us to throw everything aside that we were involved with? Terence was going to school, I was as well, and at the time he'd finished about 2 years of travel. But what possessed us to throw everything aside and go to the Amazon in 1971? Well, the reasons were complex. On one level, it was simply an ethnobotanical expedition. We were fascinated by DMT. As a group, we thought DMT was a more interesting psychedelic than any other psychedelic we'd ever encountered. And in fact, sometimes in my talks, I say it was the most interesting thing we had encountered, not simply a drug. And we felt it was important. We had an intuition that it had something to do with potentially as a portal to a hyperspatial dimension. That was the framework in which we were, that was the context in which we were looking at this. But it started out prosaic enough. We had been experimenting with smoked DMT since about 1968. It was very rare at the time, but Terence was able to find it, and we were, it just seemed like an order of magnitude more weird and interesting than LSD, which was pretty much what was available at that time. And so we thought, and then there was this sense, because the experience of DMT is very, what you might call alien-esque, very science fiction-ish, and it's cast many bizarre entities and that sort of thing that seemed to be encountered, and a great deal of the entities on the other side, if you want to put it that, in this place, always seem very eager to impart information. So one of the sort of disappointments of DMT, or shortcomings, I don't know if it's a disappointment, but it's very short. It only lasts about 20 minutes. So by the time you just begin to get accustomed to the place you're in, if such a thing is even possible, but once it's already beginning to fade away. And so we thought that if we could find an orally active form of DMT, it would last longer, basically. It's just a very naive assumption that the pharmacokinetics would be more stretched out. We could spend more time in that place, and we definitely thought of it as a place, and get our sea legs and explore it more in depth. And so when we heard about, at this time, no one understood the pharmacology of ayahuasca. I mean, we knew what ayahuasca was, but the fact that it was also an orally active form of DMT was not really clear in 1971, because the importance of the DMT admixture plants had not really been investigated at that point. So when we found this paper by Schultes called Verola as an orally administered hallucinogen, we were fascinated, because it seemed like this is what we were looking for, this orally active form of DMT. And we thought, well, we should go after this thing. We were, and see what's going on. We were all immersed more or less in our cultural context. It was a time of political turmoil, much like the contemporary times. And we were disillusioned. We didn't really see any political or social solutions to what was happening. So we kind of raised our sights a little bit and decided, well, let's see if there's a way to alter the nature of reality itself. And we thought maybe this is the key to that. So that is what led us to go to La Chorrera in search of this thing, which we came to call the secret. But it was a kind of tongue-in-cheek term. We also called ourselves the Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. And occasionally, and again, that was tongue-in-cheek as well. I mean, if you're going after ultimate secrets, you may as well have a sense of humor about it. And so we tried to keep that perspective. And we decided to go after this thing. So it started out as a fairly prosaic, interesting enough, but basically a fairly prosaic ethnobotanical expedition to find this exotic hallucinogen. And all of this has been pretty well unpacked in my brother's book, True Hallucinations, and my book, The Brotherhood of the Screaming Abyss. So we went there on the naive assumption that we would find this preparation, which the Witoto called oo-koo-hey, and we could explore it. This would be the entry into this hyperspatial portal that we kind of thought, wanted to believe, I guess you could say, was really an access to some other dimension, you know, where that dimension might be. I mean, I guess hyperspace is everywhere. So I look at this in some ways, our interest in finding this incredibly obscure psychedelic, known only to a couple of tribes in the region, almost as though it was a siren song in a certain way. It was what called us to come to the Amazon and to go to this place. When we got to the Amazon, when we finally, and the rationale for going to La Chorrera was very simple. It was that was the ancestral home of the Witoto people. It's interesting, this is maybe an aside, but it's interesting that William Burroughs had come through La Chorrera decades before looking for ayahuasca. I don't know if he found it, but as far as I know, we were the only gringos since William Burroughs passed through there to come to La Chorrera, because there was absolutely no reason to go. And we got there, and we had been cautioned by an anthropologist that we'd encountered on the way in, who told us, who, number one, was appalled that we showed up. I mean, this was 1971. There's no way to send an email or let people know that you're on your way. You just sort of show up in the village. And he was flabbergasted. I guess the term is gobsmacked. But he made the best of it. But when we told him that we were interested in oo-koo-hey, he kind of freaked out. You know, he said, you just can't go in there and start talking about this. This is like major shamanic magic for these people. They will probably kill you if you go blabbing about this. We heard him, and we respected that. And so when we finally got to La Chorrera, we encountered him in a village on another river called El Encanto. And in order to get to La Chorrera, we had to go from El Encanto 4 days overland to this parallel river, the Rio Igaraparaná, which is where La Chorrera was located. So we did this 4-day trek through deep jungle along this trail that had been built by Witoto slaves during the rubber boom. And when we finally arrived at La Chorrera, what we found was that the area around this mission village had been cleared and for pasture, and they had brought in the Cebu cattle, the white humped backed cattle, whose dung happens to be the preferred substrate for Psilocybe cubensis, the pan-tropical psilocybin mushrooms. And when we got there, we settled into our hut that they made available for it. We thought, well, we'll make discreet inquiries about oo-koo-hey, but try to avoid alarming anybody or touching on any cultural taboos. So we'll play it cool, basically. But in the meantime, here are these mushrooms, and they're everywhere. And we were very naive about that. I mean, we had almost no experience with the mushrooms. We knew what they were. We had encountered them on the way in at another town that we stopped at on the way in. There were a few, but not enough to get a really solid dose. So we had had a very light encounter with the mushrooms, and they seemed quite friendly. So when we got to La Chorrera, we kind of had a very cavalier attitude toward them. We thought these will be a nice distraction while we wait for oo-koo-hey to show up, while we wait for this secret to show up. Well, we started eating mushrooms on a pretty regular basis, and in substantial doses at some times. And quickly the mushrooms made it clear that they were the secret. And they very quickly rearranged our priorities. And we realized that, we'd come for the perfect the perfect orally active form of DMT. And we thought it was oo-koo-hey. Actually, it's the mushrooms, you know, and you think of the mushrooms pharmacology, it really is the active ingredient in mushrooms, psilocybin, is converted to psilocin, and psilocin is very, very close to DMT on the molecular basis, and the subjective experiences of high doses of mushrooms are not unlike DMT, very similar. It's the same dimension, essentially, the same place. So we started consuming mushrooms, and they quickly took over the conversation in a way. And anyone who has had experience with psilocybin mushrooms at high doses and in states of darkness or isolation, they very much lend themselves to a sort of dialogue. An I-thou relationship emerges. It appears that you are in contact with some intelligence, whether it's the mushrooms or something channeling through the mushrooms. And we were in that place, and the mushroom began to wrap down to us the details of an experiment that we could do. And it was basically a biophysical experiment. Say, one of the phenomena that we had noticed when we were taking these high doses of mushrooms was that we could hear an audio tone inside our head. A tone is not exactly the word that describes it, but kind of a buzzing or electrical tone, which is common with DMT too. One hears things on DMT that are probably not in the external world. So we could hear this tone, but not only could we hear it, we could actually sing to it. We could try to imitate the tone. And when that happened, if you could lock on to the tone, it produced a extremely powerful expulsion of sound that seemed to, well, we didn't know exactly, but it was a very interesting phenomenon. And then the mushroom is explaining that this was the electron spin resonance of the tryptamine molecules intercalating into our DNA. Well, of course, that's complete nonsense in terms of the way we understand these things to work. You know, the molecules do not bind to DNA as far as we know, but you know, in that way that the mushrooms have of sort of oracularly proclaiming this is the way it is, we were not really able to question it. We accepted that. It described the protocol for doing an experiment, where we thought of it as an experiment. It wasn't really an experiment because it was not properly designed as an experiment with, you know, controls and all that. But the intuition was that if we were to sing this song, sing this tone to the mushrooms, while mushrooms were metabolizing in us, that we could excite the DNA in both the mushrooms and ourselves into a hyper activated state, so that it would generate a standing waveform that would actually be visible and that would be radiating or broadcasting the information in DNA on the phylogenetic level. This is what we were told. And 50 years on, or even less than that, it's like, if you really reflect on this, none of this makes sense, you know, in a certain way. But when you're in the middle of this experience, you know, we did not really question whether it made sense. It seemed to make perfect sense, and we were not really into. We didn't make any attempt to be skeptical or you know, argue with the teacher. The mushroom quickly became identified in our minds as the teacher. And whether the teacher was the mushroom itself or some alien entity that was channeling through the mushroom. We didn't know, and that was like not an important detail. But it explained how to carry out this experimental protocol involving making sounds based on what we could hear in our head and essentially performing a kind of psychosurgery on ourselves to create an artifact that would be visible, that would be made of mind and matter at the same time. So a kind of psychobiological artifact that we created, that we would create out of our own bodies. And even as I hear myself describing this, I'm a little flabbergasted by how just crazy this is, these ideas. Yet, at the time, they made perfect sense. We predicted that if the experiment succeeded, certain things would happen. Namely, that the DNA in the mushroom would be activated to a superconducting state, and it would form a standing waveform that was stable, that was visible, that was essentially an extension of ourselves, or an extension of this hyperdimensional hybridization between ourselves and the mushroom. So it was a biological object, but a psychic object at the same time. And that it would be visible. It would be, in fact, the logos made visible, pure information. And we talked about translinguistic matter as the expression of what you could see. This projection of sound would actually become visible. And there's plenty of text in the Bible and so on that talks about the word and the word becoming visible. So this was kind of the loose framework that we were working under. What we had predicted would happen when we made this sound was that the mushroom would explode as it plunged toward near absolute zero in order to obtain the superconducting state. And what would be left would be a visible lenticular object that you could both see and be at the same time. And that it would respond to the imagination. It would respond to telepathic commands and could literally do anything that you could dream up for it to do. So how's that for bananas?
Yeah, well, it's fascinating. I'd like to take a couple of steps back.
Sure.
And I'm sure that people listening would want to hear some more about the context. Not only, you mentioned the wider political context at that time, in the turn of the 70s, but it's also the personal context that particularly you and Terence were experiencing immediately going into that situation. So you'd both suffered some adversities. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about those contexts, and also the other members of the expeditions, because I understand there was some interpersonal issues that were of interest, were unfolded there. So perhaps you could get into that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, there was a lot about this expedition and this decision to do this, to take this trip to La Chorrera. For my brother and I, that was very personal, because our mother had just died a few months earlier in October of 1970. She had died of cancer, had been battling cancer for a long time. My brother was unable to come into the country while she was on her deathbed, so he wasn't able to see her, which was very concerning to him. He was very upset about that. So he was not able to be with my mother when she died. I was with her, But I think we both came out of that with a great deal of guilt about essentially being selfish young men, full of our own preoccupations and our own fantasies, and maybe not giving her the support that she really deserved in her final days. And so I think part of the subtext of the experiment at La Chorrera was the thinking that we could actually change the nature of space-time. We could actually change the timeline and seize the controls and perhaps even save her by going back in time. And the invention that we were making would of course be able to travel in time. It would be able to do anything like that. So there was that element that we could bring about healing post facto, in a way. After her death, we could actually still help, at least salve our own guilty consciousness about it. Now, the people that accompanied us, they were all friends of Terence's from the Tussman program at Berkeley, the so-called experimental college. And these folks were, they were interested, of course, in psychedelics as we were, but they were maybe not quite as fanatical as we were. And as we got to La Chorrera and began to move into this very peculiar conceptual space, they sort of recoiled away from it, and they sort of became, I shouldn't say sort of, they actually became very concerned that Terence and I were going off the rails, and maybe we were. They were not convinced of the information that we were downloading, and we were utterly convinced about it. So we were like, they became the non-believers, and we just basically put them off. We just said, look, this is happening. We understand perfectly each other what we're trying to do, and we understand what the mushroom teacher is trying to teach us to do. So there was, as things wore on and we attempted the experiment, and the experiment did not have the predicted outcome. Instead, it put us both into a prolonged altered state. And in my case, I became completely dissociated from reality and was taking a trip through these higher dimensions, which I was experiencing as this alternate solar system, or the solar system as my narrative as I moved into these dimensions was telling me, did not at all resemble our current understanding of the solar system. So I was pretty much estranged from reality at the time. And Terence's response was to be almost the exact opposite. He became hyper-vigilant, and he became very, very focused on the environment, and particularly on me, because he felt, I think, again, on the personal level, I think there was some feeling that, he dragged his little brother to the Amazon and then driven him crazy, which is what he's been trying to do all his life. So he'd finally succeeded, but then he got a little guilty about that. So he was focused on me to look after me, essentially, because at that point, for a couple of weeks after we did the experiment, I was really 3 sheets to the wind. I could not, I was just not in touch with reality. So that was concerning to our companions. Not that there was much that they could do about it. We just had to let it play out, and that's one of the things about the experiment at La Chorrera, just on a personal level, that I'm very grateful for. The fact that, what was happening to me, Terence understood. We were in sync. We were in communication, and he recognized the need to protect me and not abort this process, to let it play out. We were both operating under the assumption that something had happened. Well, something did happen, not exactly what we had predicted, but we were working under the assumption that maybe we had succeeded, and it just had not manifested quite in the way that we thought. So our operating assumption is everything is fine, stay the course, just let it play out. And so we did. And all of the peculiar events that unfolded after the experiment at La Chorrera are described in both of our books, including the UFO sighting that came some days later that Terence saw. Other aspects of the experiment was the time wave. The time wave is a mathematical construction that Terence elaborated over decades, actually. But the seeds of the idea were planted in his head at the experiment at La Chorrera. We performed the experiment, and the idea was to condense the stone, condense this object, which we started calling the stone, like the philosopher's stone. And we figured that we'd performed the experiment, we'd succeeded because of apparently anomalous events that happened right after we'd performed the experiment, but that our timing was off. And the stone was going to condense, but we couldn't predict when. And that's what led to Terence constructing all of these cycles that eventually turned out to be the basis of the time wave. He was trying to suss out, when is this thing going to show up? When will it actually manifest? And, and as it turned out, it did not manifest then. It's never manifested, but the time wave was constructed in part as a instrument to sort of nail down when this transcendental object at the end of time, which has sometimes been called, would appear. And we knew that if it did appear and it was what it purported to be, that would in fact be the end of time. So we were trying to end history, basically, and he was trying to predict when this event would manifest. And at first, it was just the local cycles around. Well, it was so many days since our mother's death that if you counted forward from the experiment at La Chorrera, it was his birthday on November 16th, 1971, and all of these different cycles. But then as he developed the time wave over time, the whole premise of the time wave was that time has an end. And he wanted to put a marker down at when is this spiral, this fractal spiral of time that the I Ching postulates, or that the time wave postulates, when is the singularity point? Because it was a contracting spiral.
I wanted to ask you about the abrupt ending of that experience, because I know that Terence had claimed in True Hallucinations that it was La Chorrera was the center of the secret and discourse like that. Mm-hmm. And it seemed to me that he had been in, because as you said, he'd been on the lam, and this seemed like an ideal sort of hideout for him. He also had fallen in love in that environment, which was bounteous with mushrooms. So when you were finally ripped out of that, it was a little like being, ripped from the womb, ripped torn from paradise. So can you explain a little bit about what happened there towards the end?
I mean, La Chorrera did seem like a magical place, when we got there, and a lot of it was seasonal because, we just happened to show up during the rainy season, which of course was the height of when the mushrooms were there. So we walked into this psychedelic paradise, and found the secret, which, I mean, we had come for the secret. We didn't know exactly what the secret was, but when we got there, it quickly became clear the mushrooms were the secret, and it wasn't hard to find. All you had to do is look down and pick them and eat them, and pretty soon you were in dialogue with the secret. And so that went on, and then we did the experiment, and I began to, spin out into some alternate reality, and our companions became concerned. And honestly, I would have been concerned too, except I wasn't, because that's what was happening to me. And I was not afraid or anything like that. I was too far beyond that to worry about it. Terence and I were working under the framework of this meme that we both understood, and our companions did not. And our companions were saying, both of you are completely nuts, and we need to get you out of here, and we need to get you to a psychiatric facility or something. And Terence pushed back against that. I was not in the conversation because I was not in any conversation except with my hyperspatial entities at that point. But they were arguing that, this is a disaster, and he was saying, no, just chill out, just let it happen, let it unfold. And I'm really grateful that he took that position, because it did actually, what would have been an abortive interruption of this psychotic break, it was actually able to heal itself, to play out, and it turned out to be a healing experience. I feel like I am a more whole person now because that happened, because of what I learned. And I don't think I'm crazy. I mean, I have some funny ideas, but I know the difference between ordinary reality and non-ordinary reality and so on. So it was very good for me. It was, in some sense, a shamanic initiation. And, I've discussed the experiment at La Chorrera in terms of, was it a psychotic break? Well, certainly of some kind it was. Was it a shamanic initiation as well? Yeah, it seemed like it was. And there are similarities, obviously, that's been discussed in anthropology and elsewhere about the initiation of shamans often involves a prolonged, essentially psychosis or altered state. The third aspect of it that I've discussed was it an alien encounter? That's a harder case to make, but there were elements of it that were characteristic of your typical alien encounter, although it seems an oxymoron to talk about a typical alien encounter. But there are certain patterns to alien encounters that you can discern. This idea, for example, of answering a call, the siren call, that was certainly there before we ever left for La Chorrera. The idea that information is transferred, and boy, was there information being transferred, not only in how to do the experiment, but also all of this stuff about time that Terence was on the receiving end of. Was any of that information valid? I don't know, but there was a ton of it. There was lots of information. And another characteristic of alien encounters is that gifts are given. You receive gifts, not only information, but actual gifts. What was the gift in this case? I've come to think that the gift and the one thing from the experiment And our trip to La Chorrera that really made a difference in the world, in its impact on society, is the fact that we brought the spores back with us, and we figured out how to grow those critters, and that has had an impact. And our motivation in wanting to grow the mushrooms when we brought them back was, well, we wanted to have access to the experience, obviously, to the mushrooms. We also wanted to share with the world we wanted to let other people have access to it as well, if they could confirm or disconfirm that there was really some weird shit out there, and as it spread through society, we got confirmation. At some point, when I was three sheets to the wind and not really in control of myself, Terence and Mike and his companions were monitoring me, making sure that I didn't hurt myself and that I didn't run off. That was the thing. I was compelled to leave our hut and go wandering among the people because I wanted to heal people, and I felt I had the power, so I wanted to go out and heal. I was charged with this energy. And at some point while all this was going on, I did get away from my companions, and I climbed the bell tower in front of the church, and I started ringing the bell, and that was an alarm that alarmed the whole community. I mean, the whole community, the community around there, the priests, a few nuns, and some of the people, they were aware that we were very strange people, and there were some very strange things going on, but they didn't pay too much attention. But when I breached security and woke up the whole mission by ringing this bell early in the morning, then our companions were like, okay, that's it. This is over. We've got to stop this. And well, what do you do if you want to stop it? They wanted to call an airplane and have us airlifted out of there, but this isn't really an option. It wasn't at the time, and that's why the experience was able to play out, because there really wasn't an option to leave. And but what did happen at that point was that they removed me from the hut that we'd been staying in, and actually took me to the holding pin. There was a police outpost there, so they put me in the holding pin, essentially just a room where I could be locked away and wouldn't wander off and hurt myself. They told me later that I completely destroyed the room. I broke up every piece of furniture in the room. There wasn't much. There was maybe a table and a chair. Tried to rip the frame off the window. And anyway, that all happened. So they were really pushing to get to call in an airplane to take us out. Well, as it turns out, one was scheduled to show up anyway. We had more or less arranged before we'd gone there for a person this bush pilot to come and pick us up. And eventually he did show up and he took us out of there. I was still pretty much, each day I was getting a little closer to reality. I was slowly deflating, slowly coming back, but still very much in a place of delusion and hallucination, and not really interpreting what was going on as it was actually going on, but more or less as it fit into my fantasies about what was going on. I remember we were airlifted to Leticia. The 2 weeks after the experiment were the most intense, but it took several weeks, and it was like every day was a little bit more another step toward condensation, toward reconstitution of my personality. eventually it fell back together. It came together, and at that point, I mean, I was pretty much done with trying to do the hypercarbylation. I had become, I guess the enormity of what had happened and the actual danger that I might have been in sort of came home to me at that time as I got more integrated into reality. At the time, I had no concern. I was not thinking about those things. But as I began to get more into consensus reality, I began to realize this was actually probably a very foolhardy thing to do. And I was lucky I didn't go completely insane forever. Maybe some people would disagree and say I did go completely insane forever, but I mask it well, apparently. So that was the sequelae that happened after the experiment.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring up one of your fellow adventurers there, who you both call Vanessa in your book, who's someone I've spoken to. That's Sarah Hartley, who has spoken to me for the first time about her experience for my book on my biography of Terence. And she's told me some very interesting stuff about the interactions, how she went in as a close friend of Terry's and had become quite estranged after that, because she was involved with this tussle over you through that whole drama where I think, as Terence had mentioned in his book, that you kept calling for the when are we going to have the media conference and so on, and then you rang the bell tower, and then all hell broke loose, and then she had this final sort of showdown with him where she thought he was really callous, and then he said, "But where are you going to be when the saucers arrive?" And something along those lines. And so, but also a fascinating thing, part about her is that Sarah, of course, gone in there with as your sort of official documenter with her reel-to-reel tape recorder and her cameras, and unfortunately, to her great sadness, she lost most of that material to mold, which is a great travesty.
Right. A few of the pictures survive. You've probably seen those pictures, but yeah, it's a pity, because all that's left all that's left are these notebooks, these journals, and one of which is the journal that I wrote leading up to the experiment. I mean, I had a journal which I brought with me, but leading up to the experiment, all of this information was being downloaded, and I was furiously trying to get it on paper, essentially to write the experimental protocol, and I remember, even as it was almost like automatic writing, I was compelled to write these things, and this was a blueprint, or like an experimental protocol. This is how you do it. And that part has survived. And then, as you know, Graham, Terence's writing also in his journal, most of which was post-La Chorrera. So what happened? Maybe it's worth going back to talk about that. What happened? I finally got my feet on the ground enough that I flew back to Boulder, and this would be like May of 1971. I flew back there, and I was ready to, get seriously into consensus reality, and I was done with all this. I wanted just to go back to school, and I determined to start studying science, which I had been before, but start sort of looking more at harder sciences. And in some ways, I think that was something that I grasped onto, as a lifeline to the consensus world. So I did that. Terence, on the other hand, Terence and Kume stayed in Colombia for a while, and then he, all the time, utterly convinced that we had done the experiment, it had succeeded. I mean, this is sort of like people that say, well, the election really was stolen. I mean, in the face of all evidence, and this was kind of Terence's attitude, that we had succeeded. And so he determined to go back to Berkeley, and which he did in, I think it was about June of '71, and talk to his, bring the good news essentially to his friends, many of, from just part of the community in Berkeley that he was part of, and utterly convinced that they would be amazed and, oh, wow, you did this thing. That wasn't what happened. They was like, you are nuts. You are completely batshit crazy. That was not the reaction that he'd expected. But they got there, and then they, and during their trip back to La Chorrera the second time, and then back from La Chorrera, they made their way back to the States through Colombia. And during this time, he was working on that manuscript, the one that you have, and the one that eventually became, well, in some sense, was a precursor to the Invisible Landscape, which was also derived from an earlier book that we had written, which was never published in that form, called Shamanic Investigations. That book was only published as a typescript with 2 or 3 volumes, but eventually that became The Invisible Landscape, which was an attempt to put some kind of a scientific framework around all of these events, and doomed to failure, essentially. I mean, it took a while to reach the point where I had to admit most of this stuff was nonsense. But it was a very seductive kind of nonsense, these ideas, which in some ways are evinced by the fact that we published the book, and the book was received with some degree of acceptance by a lot of people. So it's not like we were totally deluded, and obviously we're deluded. Or if we were, other people were too. These ideas had a power about them.
Jump in and say something about one of the reviews that I've seen. It was a 1976 review, just a one-line review of The Invisible Landscape from the Journal of Parapsychology. And the line is, the authors attempted deliberately to induce in themselves a state similar to, if not identical with schizophrenia. There is no personal derogation to remark that their book suggests that they succeeded. So I'm not sure that there were too many reviews of The Invisible Landscape. Maybe you could tell me, it was such an obscure book, certainly back in the days, but then it was then there was another edition in '94. This was a review from 1976.
Yeah. No, The Invisible Landscape is a very peculiar volume, because it does try to provide some kind of a scientific rationale for what was happening, and it's inherently impossible, to do that. I think that a much more, honest rendition of what happened was Terence's book True Hallucinations, which was basically a narrative of what went on when we went to La Chorrera, and it reads like a novel. It's not technical at all, and all of the sort of technical mumbo jumbo that we put into the Invisible Landscape, it didn't. I mean, it seemed implausible at the time, and as the years went on, it didn't wear well. If you look at some of these concepts, they're clearly just not valid. For example, the time wave itself, Terence and many of my theories that were downloaded in the experiments, my theories about drug action, and that the idea that the tryptamines intercalate into DNA, and that these are the receptors for the tryptamine psychedelics, at least. And they, in 1971, nobody knew even what a serotonin receptor was. We had no idea about the actual structure of these things. Well, now we've totally elucidated this. Science has, I should say. We know the tertiary and primary structure of the serotonin receptors. We know where the psychedelic receptors are located in the brain. And, the understanding of all that is very good. There has been progress. Back in 1971, nobody had a clue, so the most cockamamie crazy ideas could be seriously considered. Similarly with the time wave, Terence constructed this mathematical object based on what he had learned during the experiment at La Chorrera and elaborated it enormously. The problem with the time wave is that it couldn't be disproved. That was the thing. That was my main criticism of the thing, that it was an entirely subjective construct. It was a mathematical construct that purported to describe, number one, that time had a structure, and that the time wave is a way to map the ingression of novelty into the continuum. This was the postulate.
To me, that there's no real way of understanding the time wave from so much a scientific perspective than a poetic and a mythopoetic perspective, because a deep analysis of that sees a lot of unconscious symbolism bubbling to the surface with Terence. The whole idea of being conquering matter and ending history. There's he himself was inspired perhaps by Jung more than any other theorist, I suspect, and that is a Jungian analysis is I think appropriate there. I mean, we're talking about how the time wave will eventually conquer death. We'll all be transported into the imagination. And so there's the question of, was this an unconscious expression of his anxiety towards his own mortality?
It could have been. Yes, it could have been. Of course, back then there was no inkling that he would, that he would be gone by the time 2012 came around. But I think it was definitely that was an element of it, anxiety about that, and the hope for essentially a better world, and the manifestation. Well, you can't separate this really from our Catholic upbringing in a certain way. I mean, that's a part of it, because Catholicism, Christianity in general, but especially Catholicism, is the religion of the apocalypse. Built into the assumptions of Christianity is that time is linear and time has an end. Unlike a lot of Eastern philosophies, which just talk about endless cycles of death and rebirth. In Christianity, time ends when the apocalypse comes, when the judgment day comes. So this was, even though we weren't exactly practicing Catholics, quite the opposite at that point. But this was built into our mindset in a certain sense, that time does have an end. And so it's the anticipation of what is that going to look like, when time ends? And can you trigger it, essentially? Can you have an influence on bringing this about? And that was both the hubris and the humility of what we were doing. When we were in the process of doing the experiment and developing these ideas at La Chorrera, we asked the entity, why us? Why are we chosen to do this if this is really going to end history? And the answer came back that because you didn't accept anything, you didn't believe what anyone told you. You had to seek the truth on your own. And of course, actually, there was maybe not truth to that. We were probably fairly well immersed in our own delusion, I think. But that was the answer, was that we didn't accept the dogma. We didn't accept what was postulated. We had to see for ourselves. And so that was effectively a very scientific approach, to look into it. But I think I think that we went at this under the assumption that we were doing a scientific experiment. The thing is, it was not an experiment for numerous reasons. It was not scientific. We were not scientists, but we were working under all these assumptions that perhaps we were. And as Eric Davis said, I think very aptly, this is built into the sort of McKenna myth, and what we did at South America, we did not commit an act of science. We committed an act of science fiction, and we were so immersed in those themes that we actually integrated that into what we were doing. That describes it more appropriately than saying it was certainly not a scientific experiment. It may have been a shamanic experiment in some ways, or a shamanic experience. But the memes of science fiction, which we both shared and had for many years, really had an influence on the way we understood this, and our cognitive categories at the time were quite loose. What happened to us led Terence to postulate that, science is utterly unable to answer any of this. This shows that science has failed in terms of understanding reality. And my attitude was, well, wait a minute, we're not scientists, so we can't really say that. We have to become scientists. We have to learn to do science and then do it before we can really evaluate what was going on. And once we can see it from within the perspective of science, we can see the gaps and the flaws in the assumptions that we were operating under. It's sort of like you can see a cool science fiction movie, something going on, and all of these terms are used, and they all sound very scientific and very cool, but are they, in the end, they're gibberish. And I think that may be what we have to say about the experiment at La Chorrera. But with the one thing that really made a difference was the fact that we brought the spores back. Nothing supernatural or paranormal about any of that. We brought the spores back. We learned how to grow them. We shared that knowledge widely by publishing the Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide. And that, over 50 years, has had an impact. I think the last 50 years would have been quite different if people did not have easy access to psilocybin mushrooms. And now, it's taken this long, but finally mushrooms are being recognized for, if not the key to the end of the world, certainly as interesting medicines that might be useful for treating mental illness, such as depression and trauma and this sort of thing, but basically as a tool to explore consciousness. I think that psilocybin is the perfect molecular probe to explore the outer fringes of consciousness. And that's been the lasting contribution, I think. Not that other people didn't figure out how to grow mushrooms. They were working on it too at the time, but we were the ones that published the book that made it possible for any intelligent and reasonably persistent 10th grader to do this in their basement. And many did. And that changed the world. That changed society. And it still is. Finally the world is waking up to the potential of psychedelics for not only healing, but also to really understand human consciousness and the place of human consciousness in the cosmos. So it wasn't entirely a waste of time.
Well, I think that your excavations here of an expedition that was sort of many things at once. It was millenarian, it was utopian, alchemical, shamanic, scientific, poetic, redemptive, and ultimately sort of a rite of passage, but with a very pragmatic outcome, as you say. You sort of democratized Psilocybin for the world, and that's a great outcome.
And in some ways, it did have this impact. It is having this impact on society, and that's the way. If you think about it, that's the way it had to happen. It wasn't that everything changed after we did the experiment at La Chorrera, but it's taken 50 years for those changes to become manifest. So in that sense, we were right, in the sense that this was a transformative discovery, but it's taken a while for the rest of the world to wake up to it, and hopefully it will lead to a better world.
I'm very thankful for you to have excavated all of that, and certainly some of your answers are helpful for my book project, which is still ongoing. So it's been great.
I'm looking forward to that, Graham. I think it's going to be a great project, and I really appreciate your coming on and discussing this. And when you get the biography written of Terence, we'll have to revisit that and unpack that. Based on your previous writing, I think that's going to be a fantastic book. So I'm really happy you've taken it on. I know it's a lot of work and it's driven you crazy in a lot of ways, but you're a very persistent scholar, and that's what it takes.
More than frankly a ridiculous task, a ludicrous task, and that no one, apart from your book, which has certainly been a useful resource as your own memoir and your life with Terence, there hasn't been an exclusive biography, probably for a lot of good reasons, as I've discovered. And yet it needs to be done, and a little bit of time on my hands to do so. And so certainly been locked down over the last year in my own personal lockdown, and we'll continue on with that project this year, and hopefully that'll be finished by the end of the year.
Yeah, it definitely needs to be done, and I'm looking forward to it. I think it'll be interesting and fits right in with all this. So lots of interest right now in sort of the cultural history of these psychedelics, and particularly psilocybin. And we could go on for a long time here and get into that, but I think this is a good, comfortable place to close out. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
It's been an honor, Dennis, and I'll catch you down the track. Thanks for having me.
All right, thanks very much. I think the significance of our trip to La Chorrera was that we encountered the mushrooms, we collected the spores, and we brought them back, and we learned how to cultivate the mushrooms. And then we made that rather simple technique available by publishing a book about it. And that made it possible for lots of people to cultivate mushrooms, but it also brought the mushrooms into our culture. You know, as a result of that, the mushrooms have been one of the more easily accessible psychedelics, one of the better ones. It's you know, it's non-toxic. It's relatively safe compared to many others. So it I guess what I'm saying is that mushrooms have been part of the cultural conversation about psychedelics ever since that time, or ever since we shared with the world the technique of how to grow it. So they have been around, they have been part of society, and have come to be accepted, and you know, and the juncture with that we've reached now is that, you know, their value as medicines has been accepted, is being recognized. I feel like, you know, we were gifted some very peculiar ideas, but on a practical level, what came out of that was we collected the spores, and we physical laws were necessary, and that has impacted society, you know, greatly. I think not that we were the only ones to bring mushrooms, to develop methods to control mushroom, to cultivate mushrooms, but we were among the first, if not the first, to put out there a very simple technique that any intelligent 10th grader could figure out. And many intelligent 10th graders and above did, in fact, figure it out. I mean, the growing mushrooms using the Olseneric technique is a lot like doing a science project, you know, so it's the perfect thing for nerds, you know, which I was at the time. And Terence said once, he said several times, and I'm fond of quoting him, he said, we're in a symbiotic relationship with something that has disguised itself as an alien invasion so as not to alarm us. And I think that's basically true. You know, I mean, the mushrooms have formed this symbiosis with humanity, and you know, it's always had it, but it didn't go global until after mushrooms were widely available. So to the extent that the experiment at La Chorrera facilitated that and led to that, it was significant. We've always been co-evolving with these things for tens of thousands of years, and quite possibly for millions of years. You know, there's reason to believe that mushrooms may have played a role in the evolution of early hominids back as far as 2 million years ago. And some of this was the theme of Terence's book, Food of the Gods. And when that book came out, it was, of course, dismissed and denounced and ridiculed. But actually, it was published in 1992, so now almost 30 years later, there's actually a new reprint being released. And if you take another look at the proposition now that mushrooms may have influenced the emergence of consciousness in hominids, even before there were actually humans, you know, before Homo sapiens, the precursors to Homo sapiens may have been influenced by mushrooms. So it's important to remember that, I mean, I guess the point I'm making here is that yes, mushrooms are medicine. They are much more than medicine. You know, that's one aspect of what they do, but they are co-evolutionary partners with us. They're symbiotic partners with us. The human species is that they are, they're stimulating the evolution of consciousness and the expansion of consciousness, and maybe pointing the way towards some future for our species. And maybe that has to do with extraterrestrial migration, or who knows, who really knows how the future is going to play out. But, that idea that our destiny is in the stars, is a persistent meme in when we think about human evolution. Like, this is where we're headed. This is our destiny. Earth is the incubator of this species that will not remain on Earth. And maybe in the mushroom experiences, you get an intuition, an intimation that is the arc of this evolutionary adventure that we are sharing with the mushrooms. We don't know what the end game of this relationship, this co-evolutionary odyssey with psychedelics. We don't know how it's going to end. What we do know is that this is a critical juncture. This is at this moment in our evolution when we're looking at a situation where, we hold within our hands as a species the ability to completely destroy the planet, to make it uninhabitable for life. Or we also hold the power to make it a paradise. And we are driven by this dream that our destiny is in the stars. Who knows? Maybe it is and maybe it isn't, but it's a good dream. How unlikely our situation is that, on this one minor planet, on a minor arm of the galaxy, and, a solar system about which there's nothing remarkable except that there is this species of primates that are quite anomalous, we think. I mean, we don't know because we have nothing to compare it to, but we think we're pretty special. and it's because of our consciousness and our imagination. I guess that's the main, if mushrooms have given us a gift as a species, they have taught us how to have an imagination, in a certain way, how to dream. And that is what drives consciousness and evolution forward. The mushrooms, not necessarily Terence and Dennis's excellent adventure with mushrooms, other than that we helped bring it to the world and spread it around, and now many people have had these experiences and confirm that they are indeed very strange, and seemingly meaningful.
Welcome back.
Hello. Yes, we've been through the abyss and we're now on the other side. So,
how are you feeling after?
I feel good. I'm trying to follow the text here and not making a very good job of that. They're coming too fast, but I appreciate the many comments that are coming in, and it looks
Really
like we have
fast.
about 50 questions. So I guess, do we want to take a break or do we just go into the Q&A? What would you like to do? How would you like to organize that?
We can start with the Q&A. I would like to give you a special thanks. Wow, I'm so grateful to be a part of this amazing experience because I didn't know a lot of this, and I have cultivated mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms. So this is like, wow, I'm going all the way to the core, to the root of this beautiful journey that I've had. So I'm so grateful, Dennis. Thank you so much, because you also mentioned it might not just have been Terence and Dennis who went out and brought this back, but when it comes down to roots, it's never like one root. It starts with one, and then it opens up to be this beautiful, magnificent tree. And I feel like this is such a blessing a blessing from the mushrooms, because they're these amazing beings to connect me to source. Thank you.
Okay, well, that's all we can hope for, right? So, so I guess what we'll do is go into the Q&A now. We'll see how the questions go. I see there are many. So
there's 51 questions.
Right, we don't necessarily have to. We don't necessarily have to stop at 30 minutes, but we'll see how it goes. And then you'll do your closing remarks, and I'll do mine, and give people the rest of their day to mull all this over.
Perfect. So let's get to these questions. Wow, so many. If you guys want to go into the ask a question and vote for which question you would like asked, we can start to choose the most popular ones. So one question, Dennis, is how do you envision the continued decriminalization and even legalization of psychedelic substances?
Well, how do I view it? I'm in favor of it, obviously. And I think this is a very good sign. I think it's a sign that our culture maybe is maturing a little bit in its relationship to these substances, which should never have been criminalized or prohibited. It's not our purview as a species to declare another species does not have the right to exist on the planet. So I'm very encouraged by the decriminalization movements, because I think that pathway to integrating mushrooms and other psychedelics into medicine at first, and society, that's the way forward for this to happen. And I look forward to the day when we are past the decriminalization movement, when these things are not prohibited. Then I think there will be opportunities for various centers to form that offer psychedelic experiences that are not operating underground, that are operating with reasonable standards, hopefully, and people should have access to these experiences. I mean, I think this is a very important part of the human experience. So it should not be denied to people. It should be available to people, but in the right context. They're not without their dangers. That they should be approached thoughtfully and respectfully. And I think, the decriminalization movement will open the way to that, to bring it to a wider world in a way that will benefit many people.
Moving to these psychedelic medicines, how can we proceed forward to optimize the healing potential for the world in a culturally and ecologically way?
Well, I think we just have to proceed. What I would hope is that mushrooms and other, what you might call traditional psychedelics that have been used by indigenous people, that should be acknowledged, and that connection should be preserved. What I would like to see is there are different, I guess, pros and cons against people going, for instance, to South America to seek ayahuasca. They are usually sincere people who are really they're not looking for thrills, they're looking for answers, they're looking for meaningful experiences. But then the tourism phenomenon puts pressure on these cultures. In some ways there are benefits, in other ways not so much. There can be adverse influence on these cultures. So what I would like to see, and the criminalization movement will lead to this, is a context where we don't need to go to South America or Mexico or wherever to have these experiences. We can find them right here. And that's going to be advance. That's going to be a net advance. And I think that in that social context, you also preserve the benefits to society and the community. These centers operate. It's not just for the people that are going there to have the experiences and in a safe place, but it's also how it impacts the community. And if these centers can operate fully in the open, then that will benefit the community, because their effects does not end with the individual. It extends to the family, the society, the larger community, ultimately to the species.
I completely agree. All right, next question. Where did you get your ideas about alchemy and the Philosopher's Stone?
Well, that one's easy. Basically, Terence and I were both very immersed in Jungian psychology at that time. During the 60s, we discovered C.G. Jung, and he wrote, we read many alchemical works or related alchemical works. Terence, much more immersed in this than I was, but the key book by Jung that was very influential was called Psychology and Alchemy. And anyone who hasn't read it should look into it. Terence once told me, back when I was a youngster, and before I ever took a psychedelic, and at that time we were talking about LSD, he said, before you take LSD, read Psychology and Alchemy. And I was like, what? Why should I do that? Well, and of course I ignored that advice. I still got plenty out of my initial LSD experience. However, after I had taken it, I understood why he said that. The Psychology and Alchemy is a good prism or lens to look at what comes up in these kinds of experiences, because this is all related to archetypes, right? And Psychology and Alchemy, in some ways, is a science of archetypes, although they don't use that language. So it was an influential book and remains so. So I recommend it, and anything that Jung wrote is quite relevant to this, as well as the other author that was influential for us was Mircea Eliade, who wrote Shamanism, the Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, along with other landmark books. So Jung was a big influence. And again, this was something that Terence discovered and shared with me, and then we both really read pretty deeply into Jungian psychology. And that provided some of the framework for what we were doing.
Beautiful. All right, let's see. What question? What was the ultimate fate of the silver key that you mentioned finding or producing during the expedition? Was it seen after returning or lost in the transit? Any thoughts on its appearance beyond what has been discussed in previous publications?
Yes, I have no idea what happened to the silver key after that event. And frankly, I have no idea how I happened to have the silver key and produce it at just that moment. If there was anything anomalous or paranormal about what was going on with us, maybe that was it. But I mean, I don't want to think that. I don't think I just manifested it out of nothing, but for some reason I had it, and I was able to produce it at a critical moment and completely blow Terence's mind, as well as my own. Where did this come from? I can't tell you what happened to the silver key. I can tell you what happened to the box that it was the key to, which was a carved wooden box that we inherited from our grandfather, and I kept it in my storage container for a long time. And eventually, I think I mailed it someplace, or for some reason, the box became completely smashed. So we don't have the box, and I don't know where the key is. Sorry.
Beautiful. How can we proceed forward to optimize the healing potential for the world in a culturally and oh, sorry, I think I already read that one.
So what is the question?
Let me find a new one. So many. I'm curious about what ideas about alchemy were in the atmosphere at the time.
Well, if you mean when we were doing the experiment, yeah, the themes of alchemy were pretty much the framework that we were carrying out this experiment in. You know, if there was any kind of a conceptual vessel for what we were trying to do, it was the stages of the alchemical process involved in the condensation of the stone, of fixing the stone, whatever that energy was, into matter. There, depending on who you read and so on, there are different stages of the alchemical process. But the one that we were focused on was this idea that you could essentially take this translinguistic matter, this hyperdimensional, quasi-psychic, quasi-material object, and fix it into something material, in this case, into the body of a mushroom. And, you know, that was the framework. The experiment at La Chorrera was really all about our attempts to condense the stone, to nail it down into a visible form that was both part of us, that we experienced, and was also external. That was the thing. As I've said many times, you could both see it and be it at the same time. And it was a transcendental object that was partly biological, partly technological, and that responded to thought. So it would do anything you could imagine. This was and this was why it was the ultimate artifact, you know, because it made all other artifacts obsolete, at least in the concept. So, yes, alchemy, and then the I Ching, which later became the framework for the Timewave. But in the experiment itself, the I Ching was not so prominent. It was really the idea that we were carrying out an alchemical transformation. That is what guided us in the steps of the experiment. That was the idea. You know, and it's important to recognize that all of this was sort of being downloaded to us in real time. It's not like we'd done our best to map this out, but then in the actual performance, you know, all of that sort of got swept aside. But that was the relevance of alchemy here in the experiment. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Could you please try and imitate the sound buzzing that you would hear? Or would you be able to recommend a song or recording that resonates with this?
No, I'm not. I'm not going to repeat the sound. I don't want to destabilize the space-time continuum. I mean, you know, we tried it before and it didn't work, but what if it worked this time? And then we'd all have problems. No, I'm not going to repeat the sound. Sorry. I don't know of any recording of it. You'll have to scour YouTube. But after we did the experiment and had the outcome that it had, I told myself, nope, I'm not going to go back. Interestingly, Terence, after the experiment at La Chorrera, on a number of occasions in our later visit to South America in 1981, which he was part of my ethnobotanical expedition, he wanted to try to repeat the experiment, and I pushed back against that. For one thing, I didn't want it. I didn't want to repeat it. And for the other thing, by the very nature of the event, it couldn't be replicated. You can't repeat that kind of an event. And ironically, that's what the Timewave is really all about. It maps the uniqueness of events, but it also shows the resonances with other events on different timescales. But no, I'm not going to repeat it. Sorry.
All right. Different psilocybin mushrooms seem to have different personalities. Do you believe the different strains are connected to specific beings with specific purposes with unique personalities? Assuming the psychoactive compound in the different strains is always psilocybin, what might account for this?
Oh boy, that's a deep and complicated question. I think it's true that different species of mushrooms seem to have slightly different personalities or different personalities. I think that different natural psychedelics have different personalities. The personality, quote unquote, of ayahuasca is very different than the personality of mushrooms. And that in turn is different than the personality of, say, peyote. A lot of these medicines do seem to have, essentially a personality or, some sort of anthropomorphic aspect to it. But it's important to recognize it, do they really have this? Are they really entities separate from us? Or are they an aspect of ourselves that we're projecting out there and that is then reflecting back on us? We're interacting with a part of ourself as though it wasn't part of ourselves, as though it was some independent entity. And I think we can't answer that question. It's a case if we don't have enough data. I mean, the sort of reductionist neuroscientists' view would be that these entities are not real. They're something that our brains create, and then we interact with them as though they were not a part of ourselves. That's the sort of most, simplistic explanation. It doesn't provide a full explanation. I don't know. I think the jury's still out. One of the questions that come up as far as the reality of these entities is, how can you prove it? How can you query this entity? And Terence used to say in his, or told me at least, that in his deep mushroom experiences, he would try to get it to tell him something he couldn't possibly know. And then that would sufficiently satisfy him that it wasn't coming from him. But it's very tricky, because how do you know what you can't possibly know? So it's hard to nail this down.
It's a great answer. And speaking of Terence, Dennis, I seem to recall that Terence promised to try and communicate you from the other side. Has he managed to pull it off yet?
As far as I know, he hasn't. The only thing I can point to are some interesting dreams in which he was very present and, assured me that he was fine, that everything was fine, and that was reassuring. But those were dreams, so I haven't, I haven't seen any anomalous or paranormal or unexplainable phenomena that I could relate to Terence's continued presence in the world. I mean, it's almost like it's not necessary because he's very much still present in the world. I mean, all you have to do is go on YouTube and you realize, in some ways, the spirit of Terence haunts YouTube, and he's managed to achieve this weird kind of digital immortality. He's very much in the conversation still 20 years after he passed on. But I have not gotten any no overt events that I could say, this is Terence knocking on the door or whatever. But I have had, as I say, vivid dreams about him and the two of us together and that kind of thing. Am I here? No, there you are. Okay. Don't do that to me. I feel lost. Okay.
At the trouble. I think there's a bit of a lag.
Right.
But we're doing really well. So on to the next question. You ready?
Bring it on.
All right. Could you speak on the connection between the mushrooms and language? Have there been any breakthroughs in this area? Are there any new scientific line of inquiry here?
There haven't been any formal inquiries or investigations of mushrooms and language, but I think it's very much part of the whole stone ape hypothesis that mushrooms, if they did play a role in the evolution of hominids back millions of years ago, it may have to do with the fact that they taught us how to have an imagination. And language is intimately associated with meaningful symbols, which may be internalized, and visual input and auditory input. And I've talked many times about how synesthesia, which is the experiencing of one kind of sensory modality in terms of another, for example, seeing sounds, and that sort of thing. Synesthetic experiences are very much possible, very common in the psychedelic experience. And when you have that synesthetic experience linked to, I guess you could call them memes or concept constellations that are deeply meaningful, that's where you find the basis of language, the ability to signify something external and name it. And in that sense, I think that mushrooms were and still are to a certain extent cognitive learning tools, teaching us how to acquire language. And of course, much of our neural architecture in Homo sapiens, at least, or in advanced hominids, is devoted to the generation and the comprehension of language. This is perhaps not accidental. Somehow our brains evolve through epigenetics or other mechanisms to really, create these structures that are capable of generating language. So I think that mushrooms may have played a catalytic role on the coevolutionary level to impart this ability. And of course, everything else comes from that. Culture runs on language. And, so this may be an inherent skill that we learn that mushrooms facilitated that process. I would like to see some studies about using psilocybin, for example, with conditions like dyslexia, which I have a feeling that we would find that they could be very therapeutic for people with dyslexia, just as they have been shown for people with stuttering, because they help you put thoughts together, basically, and that's an important thing that they can do.
I am a chemist specializing in synthesis of psychedelic compounds. And I was wondering, what is your opinion on synthetic versus natural hallucinogens?
I don't really have an opinion. I think there's a place for both. I think that, even synthetic psychedelics, as I often say, are not outside of nature. Nothing is outside of nature. Even synthetic psychedelics are made by all natural organic chemists, right? So they're a natural product in themselves. I don't see any inherent superiority in natural psychedelics versus synthetic psychedelics, other than maybe the cultural associations that they have. But there is a place for synthetics. I'm glad that there are synthetic chemists that are exploring sort of the molecular cartography of the psychedelic experience, as Sasha Shulgin did for many years, invented many compounds and tested them all carefully on himself and kept good notes. So, go chemistry. I'm all for chemistry. But I think perhaps we should be careful not to lose the connection to these natural psychedelics like mushrooms and ayahuasca, and also to honor the indigenous connections that these things have, which you don't find in synthetic psychedelics.
Such a beautiful connection with these medicines. Do you have a favorite mushroom species? Cubensis is the most common, but there are a variety with much more psilocybin content.
Right. Psilocybin, Psilocybe cubensis is the most common because it's the most easily cultivated. Some of the other species native to Pacific Northwest, like Psilocybe biocystis, Psilocybe cyanescens, are more potent, maybe about twice as potent. I don't think potency makes that much difference because, you can always eat more. I mean, if you don't have a sufficient dose, the mushrooms are not toxic, so you can just eat enough that you reach the level that you want. I personally have not experimented with many species. I've experimented with cyanescens and biocystis and cubensis, and they all deliver the goods. So it's a matter of preference, I think.
All right. Thank you guys for your patience with this wonderful internet that we have. I'm so grateful internet even exists. So thank you for hanging in there with this lag and these technical things. Terence sometimes spoke on the significance of the geek mystery religions. What are your thoughts on Brian Rurescu and his research on ergot as a possible ingredient in the Eleusinian mysteries?
Well, funny you should mention that, because I don't know if the letters are reversed. It looks like they are. I have read Brian's book. I'm very impressed with his scholarship, and we're actually, the next McKenna Academy podcast is going to be an interview with Dr. Marurescu about this book. I think he's nailed it down. I think that the Road to Eleusis was an important sort of initial book about this, but then the scholarship that Brian has put together in this book shows that, that these psychedelic mystery religions did exist in various parts in Italy and Spain, as well as Greece. It was not just Eleusis, it was also the cults of Dionysus. were also ecstatic, psychedelic mystery religions. And these things were the precursors of Christianity. So early Christianity, the Eucharist in early Christianity, before the church took it over formally and made it all politically correct, but the early Christian Eucharists were probably similar brews to these fermented beverages that were used in the Eleusinian mysteries and also in the Dionysian mysteries. So when Brian and I have an interview, we're going to unpack all this, and that will be our next podcast. I can't tell you exactly when, but probably later in this month, we're going to do that. So stay tuned.
So juicy. And speaking of juicy, there's this juicy question that I'm going to ask.
A juicy
question. Do you continue
question.
to make the use of plants, or have you gotten that message? Or have you gotten the message and hang up the phone, so to speak, and hung up?
So could you repeat the question?
Yes. I don't see you. Is it everything all right on your side with your camera?
Yeah, everything's fine. I can see you, and can you see me?
Let's go on. And
I can see myself, and you're then the McKenna
well,
Academy.
let's see what's happening. Let me ask this question. Do you continue to make... Ooh, you ready?
Yes.
Do you continue to make the use of plants, or have you gotten the message and hung up the phone, so to speak?
Well, I've gotten the message, but I have not hung up the phone entirely. Actually, I haven't hung it up at all. I still think that I've been taking psychedelics for longer than 50 years. I'm still learning. I don't know if I will ever reach a place where I hang up the phone. If I reach that point, it will be because for health reasons or whatever, I can't keep taking psychedelics. But as far as reaching a point where I say, yep, I've learned everything there is to know, I can hang up the phone, I don't think one reaches that point. I think that psychedelics will, as long as one keeps a relationship, they will continue to surprise us, and they will continue to give us food for thought, essentially. I'm not a person who says that, they're not an answering machine. You should keep engaged. If you do learn from these things, whether they're real entities or some part of yourself that they open up, why would you abandon that relationship? So I haven't hung up the phone and don't really intend to until I'm forced to.
And have you ever returned, or would you return to La Chorrera?
I have never returned there. I have had thoughts about going back there. But on some level, I think, what's the point? There really is no point, because it was a unique place in space and time, and I could go back to La Chorrera if I wanted to, but I think I would be disappointed. I think there would not be much there. Of course, it depends on, I guess, what season that you come. If it's the rainy season, the pastures will be there. Who knows what's happened to that place in the last 50 years? I know that for part of the time, at least in the 80s and 90s, it became quite a nexus for cocaine transport, cocaine production and transport. So, when we had thought about going back in 1981, we were warned that, the narco traficantes had pretty much taken it over, and it was not a good place to go. So I probably won't go back to La Chorrera. I don't see much reason to do that. If someone makes a documentary or whatever and wants to fly me in there and fly me out, I might consider that. But no, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to repeat the Heart of Darkness adventure. I'm old, people. I'm too old for that now. I mean, I was a young man at the time. I was 20 years old. I didn't know what I was doing, as most young men 20 years old, as is the case with most young men 20 years old. That's why, it's the benefit of ignorance, in a way. Not knowing what you can't do, then you don't recognize your own limits. So you go ahead and do it. And that's where it becomes interesting. But, I'm much more, shall we say, down to earth right now. And yeah, so I don't see any reason to go back.
Beautiful. Well, that is the end of our Q&A. Thank you so much, Dennis, for sharing all that amazing information. So many gems. I'm so grateful. Is there any last remarks you would like to share?
Well, yes, I'd like to thank everyone who came to this event, and I'd like to thank them for the excellent questions. And and there are a bunch of people that need to be thanked for this, starting with you, Abby, for being such a wonderful moderator for this, and the whole McKenna Academy team. The video that we essentially, I'm not a person who says that, they're not an answering machine. You should keep engaged. If you do learn from these things, whether they're real entities or some part of yourself that they open up, why would you abandon that relationship? So I haven't hung up the phone and don't really intend to until I'm forced to.
And have you ever returned, or would you return to La Chorrera?
I have never returned there. I have had thoughts about going back there. But on some level, I think, what's the point? There really is no point, because it was a unique place in space and time, and I could go back to La Chorrera if I wanted to, but I think I would be disappointed. I think there would not be much there. Of course, it depends on, I guess, what season that you come. If it's the rainy season, the pastures will be there. Who knows what's happened to that place in the last 50 years? I know that for part of the time, at least in the 80s and 90s, it became quite a nexus for cocaine transport, cocaine production and transport. So, when we had thought about going back in 1981, we were warned that, the narco traficantes had pretty much taken it over, and it was not a good place to go. So I probably won't go back to La Chorrera. I don't see much reason to do that. If someone makes a documentary or whatever and wants to fly me in there and fly me out, I might consider that. But no, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to repeat the Heart of Darkness adventure. I'm old, people. I'm too old for that now. I mean, I was a young man at the time. I was 20 years old. I didn't know what I was doing, as most young men 20 years old, as is the case with most young men 20 years old. That's why, it's the benefit of ignorance, in a way. Not knowing what you can't do, then you don't recognize your own limits. So you go ahead and do it. And that's where it becomes interesting. But, I'm much more, shall we say, down to earth right now. And yeah, so I don't see any reason to go back.
Beautiful. Well, that is the end of our Q&A. Thank you so much, Dennis, for sharing all that amazing information. So many gems. I'm so grateful. Is there any last remarks you would like to share?
Well, yes, I'd like to thank everyone who came to this event, and I'd like to thank them for the excellent questions. And and there are a bunch of people that need to be thanked for this, starting with you, Abby, for being such a wonderful moderator for this, and the whole McKenna Academy team. The video that we did and this event is staged, it's produced. So this is a reflection of a lot of creative talent, and I'm very grateful to be working with this Academy team. I mean, you guys are, I guess awesome is an overworked word, but I think it applies in this case. You just did a fantastic job. I want to thank everyone who helped promote this on their social media. That's really important to get the word out. That's why we have such a robust attendance. And of course, the real stars of this show are the mushrooms themselves and the indigenous people that have been the stewards of this wisdom for so long, yes, that have maintained this relationship since our prehistoric past. Who knows how long we've had this relationship. But if it weren't for these cultures that have kept this knowledge over thousands of years under conditions of great adversity, we would not be able to share this knowledge as we try to integrate it into our 21st century culture and try to find our way to a better world. And the mushrooms are here to help us achieve that wisdom, achieve that insight, and essentially, in some ways, act on the lessons that we learn from the mushrooms. So that's all important, to show gratitude. We're very blessed. The very fact that we're all participating in this and engaging in this shows how blessed we are, and we need to be grateful for that. And I wanted to say also, as you know, as we've not failed to repeat many times, if you want to support the Academy and its good works, we very much appreciate your support. We appreciate the people that, in a lot of instances, paid a little, in some cases, quite a lot more than our asking price for these podcasts. But you can also make a donation. We have other projects going on. We officially received our registration a couple of weeks ago, so we're now a 501c3 nonprofit registered with the IRS. So if you're an American, you can get donations. You could get a tax deduction for your donation, and we very much appreciate your support. And just stay tuned. Sign up to our website and stay tuned for our upcoming event. Of course, COVID has changed our development trajectory as well. The Academy originally wanted to do many more physical conferences and retreats and so on. We can't do that now, so we're trying to do these virtual conferences. The next one, as I mentioned, will be with Brian Morescu on the immortality key. And then a little later this spring, we're planning a mini symposium on the stoned ape hypothesis. And it will have Brian and Paul Stamets and some other luminaries, and it should be a very interesting afternoon's worth of conversation as we unpack the stoned ape hypothesis and look at it from the perspective of 20 years after it was written. This is to acknowledge and recognize that the UK, Penguin Books UK, has reprinted The Food of the Gods. So it's partly to bring people's attention to that. And that will be coming up. So again, I just thank you very much for your support. Stay in touch through our newsletter, and I hope you enjoyed this. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dennis. Have a beautiful day. And thank you to everyone who made donations. Your donations help other people who don't have the funds be part of this amazing experience. Thank you to the amazing, magical people that are in the background that are doing all the hard work back there to make this live stream possible. I'm so grateful. I hope you all have an amazing, magical, stupendous remainder of your day. Abby Navarro here. Love, light, and a lot of abundance.